Hello, I'm ANEKA from Made to Sew and welcome to my Sewing for Beginners series. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to do a blind hem on the sewing machine. So grab some scrap fabric and I will show you how I create a professional looking blind hem. So let's take a look at a blind hem stitch. Now this would be the wrong side of the fabric and the hem, and that is what you see on the bottom of the hem. Now if I turn this over, this is what you would see from the right side of your garment. Tiny little dots, and in some places you do not see the dots at all. Now, obviously I've used a black thread so that it's nice and visible for you, but if you were using the same color thread, these would not be visible. So what is a blind hem stitch? Well, we're going to be creating this and putting our fabrics through the sewing machine like so. There are about 3 to 4 stitches flat on the fold of the hem, and then one little zigzag stitch that catches the folded edge of the fabric. Now, if your sewing machine doesn't have a blind hem stitch function, you can do something very similar by hand, and I will plan to do a tutorial on that in the near future. In this tutorial, we're going to be chatting through how to press the fabric, the thread you should be using, the settings on your machine, to create a professional looking blind hem. Now the blind hem stitch looks like this stitch here, almost like a bit of a heartbeat. There is a straight stitch with interspersed zigzags happening on the left hand side. Now to do a blind hem on your sewing machine, you're going to need to check that firstly your machine offers a blind hem stitch, and you're going to want to get a blind hem foot. Now this is the blind hem foot for my Bernina, and this came with that sewing machine. And just to show you the difference, this is a blind hem foot for a Husqvarna, and again it came with the sewing machine. Now you may have a blind hem foot that has come with your sewing machine, you may have to purchase one as an extra. Now you're going to want to begin by pressing up your hem. Obviously this depends on the hem allowance that you have on the garment that you're making. Personally, I like to use about 1.5 inches, 4 centimeters, something like that for the majority of the garments that I'm making. Now, hopefully you can see that this is the wrong side of the fabric, and I have actually finished the bottom hem edge of my garment, and I've used an overlocker or serger for this. You can, however, use an edge finishing stitch on your sewing machine, such as an overcast stitch, a zigzag stitch, or even pinking shears. And I'm going to show you another method if you don't want to finish the edges in a second. Now, as you can see, I have simply pressed up towards the wrong side. So that is the right side of my fabric. This is the wrong side. A little tip for pressing. I would recommend that you really only just press along the bottom edge here. You don't want to press over the top edge because this can emboss this ridge into the front side of your fabric. So make sure that you're really just positioning the iron along that bottom edge. Let me show you another way you can press your hem. Now and again, I have got my fabric with the wrong side facing up here. This would be the right side of my garment facing the table. Now with this technique, I perhaps don't have an overlocker or serger, and I don't want to use an overcast or zigzag stitch on my sewing machine. So instead I've actually pressed under that top edge here. So what you would do with this method is you would firstly press up the hem allowance from the bottom, again remembering to really just press this edge. Then you would position the hem allowance down and press up along the top edge of your hem allowance an amount. I generally do about 1/2 inch, which is 1.2 centimeters, but a centimeter would work if that is easier for you. And you're simply pressing that to the wrong side, so you're going to be able to hide the fraying edges of the fabric. Then I would fold this back up and repress the bottom edge. Just like with the other technique, you don't really want to press the top edge too much because again, it could emboss this ridge onto the right side of your fabric. Take your time when pressing. I recommend that you use a ruler or a tape measure or perhaps a pressing gauge so that you can make sure the hem is even all the way around the product that you're making. What you do need to be cautious of with this technique is that your fabric isn't too thick. If you're working with a thick fabric, then you may prefer to not press under that top edge and to use the technique I showed you with the overlocker or serger. Again, if your fabric doesn't fray, you could leave this as a raw edge, or you could even attach some hemming tape. And I'll do another tutorial that shows you how to attach the hemming tape and use that if you're interested. So we've pressed our hem up and we're ready to go to the sewing machine. This is the right side of my garment and this is the wrong side of my garment. So how are you going to feed this into the sewing machine to do a blind hem stitch? Well, what you need to do is you actually need to sort of pinch at the join of the hem and fold the fabric back on itself. Let me show you that. So you've got the hem with the wrong side facing up, and then the fabric gets rolled back on top. And you're going to want to give this a nice press to hold it in position, or use some pins to hold it. The distance between the folds of the fabric here and the edge of your hem needs to be about 1/4 inch, 6mm minimum. Now, personally, I find it easier to give this a nice press, make sure that you measure the distance and that it's correct all the way along. If you prefer, you can use some pins. It can be easier to position your pins in vertically in this case, and make sure that the pin enters the fabric at the same point. So I would measure from this top edge of my hem allowance, and I would position my pin in 1/4 inch or 6mm, perhaps 1 centimetre away from the edge. What that means is that then I can fold my fabric back and my pins are going to hold everything in place. And the head of the pin is here, which makes it easy for me to remove. So that's one way that you could do this, but I'm going to show you an even easier way. And that is to baste or tack your hem in position first. Now we're going to complete a basting stitch or a tacking stitch. It is a straight stitch with a length of 4mm or greater. Now I've got the wrong side of my fabric up here and obviously my hem. And I'm just going to run the edge of my hem against the edge of my foot. Basically, you want to be stitching about 1/4 inch, 6mm to 3/8, 1 centimetre away from the edge here. No back stitch, you're just going to whiz this through the machine. If you prefer to draw the line on to stitch, then you're welcome to do that. And here is the basting or tacking stitch. Wrong side of the fabric facing up. Here is the hem, and this would be the right side of my fabric. Now, I often do this and I'll baste or tack my hem in place, and I'll actually try the garment on and check that I'm happy with the hem on the customer or on myself. And then I would take it to the machine and obviously do my blind hem. So there is a usefulness in doing this technique, as well as making it easier to achieve a professional looking blind hem. Now, what you're going to do now is to fold it over, just like we did with the other technique. And you've got wrong side of the fabric facing up. This would be the hem. So if I opened that up, that is your hem. And here we are ready to go to the machine to complete the blind hem. So it makes it really easy to get a nice straight line here. Obviously you can press this again if you want to. I personally don't tend to. I tend to take it to the machine like this and go straight in with my blind hem. One thing to note is that the distance from the edge of the fabric that you did your basting stitch needs to be smaller than the distance in which you pressed under this edge. If you're doing the technique like I've got here, where I've pressed under this edge. Obviously, if you finished it with an overlocker or serger, then it doesn't matter so much. So just to remind you, I pressed under 1/2 inch, 1.2 centimeters, and my basting or tacking stitch is approximately 3/8, 1 centimetre, just under that from the edge. I generally go with about 1/4 inch, 6mm to 1 centimetre or 3/8. Let's go to the machine and let me show you the blind hem. I've positioned my blind hem foot onto the sewing machine. With my Benina, that's foot 5. And I'm going to choose my blind hem, stitch 7. Now we're set up, ready to do the blind hem. Remember, this would be the wrong side of my fabric here, and my hem allowance is peeking out there. My blind hem foot is on. Now you're going to want to make sure that this little bar at the front of this blind hem foot runs straight into the fold of your wrong side of the fabric here. That's what you're lining it up with. Then you can amend the width. the stitch is going to move once on the left-hand side to take a little pick or a little bite of this folded edge. You want this to pick up the tiniest amount of fabric with it still catching the fabric. It will then do a couple more stitches on the right-hand side and over it goes for the bite. Just like that. I would always recommend that you test prior to doing with the fabric that you're working with. I try and reduce my width so that I make sure I am still getting that little bite. This is a cotton fabric with a small percentage of elastane, and I'm using a width of 3.1 millimeters here, just to keep you aware of what I'm doing. I generally try and keep a sort of medium pace. I don't do this too quickly. I want to make sure that I'm catching the fabric. And you've got to make sure here as well that this is staying really nice and flat and it's not rolling over. You're keeping everything really nice and straight. This edge here should be on the same part, feeding into the same part of the plate. And when you get to the ends, then you would finish. You can do a back stitch with this stitch to secure things. I would recommend doing the back stitch when it's doing the 3 stitches along. Otherwise, you're free to tie off. And I have a tutorial that shows you how to tie off your threads. I'll pop a link to it here. And that is how the blind hem stitch looks. Now, you may need to have a little bit of a tweak with the tension as well. Depends on the fabric that you're working with. Sometimes I will sort of loosen my needle thread tension slightly, but it really does depend on the fabric that I'm working with. Just something to bear in mind. As always, make a test and check it before you do it on the real thing. And here you have your blind hem. So this would be the wrong side of my fabric. This is my blind hem stitch. Obviously, we popped it through the machine like so. And then if I turn this all the way over, so you can see the right side, and here we go. You can see very, very tiny little pricks of stitches here. And that's partly because I'm using a black thread, so it is going to be visible. I want to make sure that you can see what I'm doing. I'm now going to take out that basting thread. So I've removed the basting thread. This would be the front of my garment, and I'm left with these tiny little pinpricks of the blind hem stitch. As I said, they would not be noticeable if I was using the same colour thread. And that is the wrong side. Now I do have a few little holes where my basting stitch was. I'm going to give this a press and those should go away. Another tip though is that I would not do a basting stitch if my fabric perhaps marked when I sewed it, so I was going to be left with a row of holes along the hem of my fabric. To be honest, if your fabric was marking that badly, I probably wouldn't do a blind hem on the sewing machine anyway. I probably would do a blind hem stitch by hand instead. And as you can see, after a quick press, the holes caused by the basting stitches have been removed. Let's take a look at doing a blind hem on a different machine. Again, on this machine, I have positioned my blind hem foot, which is foot D. And I'm going to be picking stitch 5, which is the blind hem stitch. Now on this machine, I do not have the ability to amend the width or the length of the stitch. It is a set stitch. My width has to be 5 and my length has to be 2.5. Now, what I do have is the ability to amend the width on this foot. Now the foot has got a little groove in here. You need to position your fabric so that the folded edge is sitting in the groove touching the right hand side. You will find when you put the foot down that actually the left hand side of this foot is slightly higher, which allows for the fold and the extra layers of fabric. When you get this all set up, you need to check, so again you're going to want to do a test piece to see how the needle is moving over and biting or taking a tiny bit of the fold of the fabric. So if I have a look now, I'm just catching the edge of the fold of the fabric here. Now, if I wasn't catching the edge of the fold of the fabric, or if I was catching too much, what I would need to do is to raise my presser foot and turn this little red dial. If I turn this towards me, then I'm going to catch more of the fabric. If I turn it away from me, I'm going to catch less of the fabric. And you are just going to want to test this. Take it slowly and make sure that you're happy with the results before you go to the real garment. And again, your sewing machine might be slightly different again. You might have a slightly different foot, so you really do need to just test this, take a look in your manual and see how you can achieve the best results. And that is the blind hem stitch on this machine. You can see that I've very just caught the edge of the fold of the fabric there. If I open this out, it should be pretty much invisible. You can just about see the black stitches there. Let me rip out the basting and I'll show you. Let's take a quick look at the good and bad examples of a blind hem. So obviously you can see this more than you would if I didn't use black thread and I used a colour matching thread, but this is what you do not want to achieve. This is because I have taken a too greater bite or width measurement into the fold of the fabric. So you need to adjust your width accordingly, which is why it's always important to make a sample. You want to have a very, very small little bite of the fabric, so it's sort of like a dot on the right side. Even less than this would be perfect. However, if you take too little, then like this bottom section here, hasn't been attached. So you need to make sure that you are actually biting enough into the fabric, but not too much. So you need to amend the width function on the sewing machine or have a play with the foot if you have the ability to amend the width on the foot and not on the width. And here you have my coloured fabric so that you can see the right side and then the wrong side with my hem. Now, I will be honest with you and I will say that some sewing machines do a better job at the blind hem than others. And my personal opinion is that if your sewing machine is not creating you a good professional finish, if you can see too much or it's not catching your stitches, simply do the stitch by hand instead. You have greater control and actually it doesn't take that long. I will be honest and say that until I got my Benina, I actually always did this by hand because I was not happy with the results that I achieved on the sewing machine. Another final thing to talk about is the thread that you're working with. Obviously, for the majority of you, you're going to want to be working with the standard thread that you've sewed the garment with because that's what you've got, that's probably perfectly colour matched, and you don't want to go out and invest in some other thread. However, just to show you, this is a blind hem thread. Look how fine that is. So this is a Gutermann thread. It's called the Gutermann Scala 360 and I use it on the overlocker, but you can also use it for blind hemming because it's pretty much invisible. You can purchase blind hemming thread and I'll pop some links in the description box below. Thanks for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video and you feel confident doing blind hems on your sewing machine.